You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the first of our two episodes devoted to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, as we interview its editor, Dora Zhang. In part one, we discuss Woolf's fascinating biography and family life. We explore her fiction and nonfiction writing and the other masterpieces she created. We learn about the motivation behind this feminist work, Woolf's central argument, and the traction that this work has gained since its publication in 1929. Dora Zhang also describes the iconic Shakespeare's sister sequence that creates a memorable hypothetical to illustrate Woolf's premise. Dora Zhang is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of Strange Likeness, Description and the Modernist Novel, which studies the works of Henry James, Marcel Proust, and Virginia Woolf. It is wonderful to have her with us today. Dora Zhang, welcome to the Norton Library Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you here to discuss your edition of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And maybe we can just start by talking about Virginia Woolf herself. Who was she? What do we really need to know about her as we approach this text?
Yeah, so she is an English writer. She was born and raised and lived all her life in London. She was born in 1882 and died in 1941. And she's part of the kind of incredible burst of experimentation across the arts that we call modernism in the early 20th century. So she's a really central figure in that movement. And, she was raised in what was essentially a kind of Victorian household. She had sort of a Victorian childhood. And then as an adult, after she left her parents' house, sort of entered into, we could say, and kind of became a chronicler of modernity, and understood herself to be doing so, to be really kind of a writer of modern fiction. That's the title of one of her very well-known essays, and really a chronicler of modern life. I think everybody at that time sort of had this sense of the world. I mean, maybe everybody has this sense that the world is continually, it's new. It's kind of you're living in an unprecedented age. But there were a lot of really seismic historical shifts at that time, not least of which was the First World War. And so those kind of historical events, historical catastrophes, but also this sense of new kind of liberation or the possibility of new modes of living and new ways of arranging social relations, new modes of subjectivity, that was all part of the air and something that she was really interested in registering in her work.
I look forward to talking about all of those aspects of Woolf's writing. Going back to her upbringing and where she came from and her time, was it predictable that she would go on to become this really keen investigator of the modern world? Or did she do it against odds?
She was born into a very literary, cultural, artistic household. So in some ways, this was her inheritance, or, her becoming a writer was not necessarily predictable, but not out of the ordinary. I mean, she came from, her father was a writer, a philosopher, a historian, the person who wrote or co-founded the Dictionary of National Biography. So his name was Leslie Stephen, so kind of eminent man of letters, I should say. And her mother was a pre-Raphaelite muse, Julia Jackson. So she kind of grew up in a very literate household, and a household that was filled with books and that was visited by many of the cultural luminaries of the day, including many of the leading novelists of the day. So, she didn't kind of come out of nowhere. This was really, in many ways, I mean, A Room of One's Own is very interested in questions of inheritance, and this is also part of her inheritance.
Is it fair that perhaps her father didn't view education for her as important as for, let's say, males?
Yeah, absolutely. So she was not formally educated, and this is something that she kind of resented and sort of felt some chip on her shoulder about all her life, as her brothers were. So she was part of a large family. I think she was a part of, I think she was one of 8, and it was a blended family. So both of her parents had children from previous marriages, and she had 4 siblings or 3 siblings of her, just her mother and her father. So her brothers were all educated at Cambridge. They went to school, and then to Cambridge, to university, and she and her sister didn't. And so she had this much more kind of piecemeal, eclectic education. She had tutors at home, including tutors in Greek and Latin and in the classics. She took some classes at a women's college at King's College London, classes for ladies at King's College London, but she didn't have this kind of formal training that her brothers got. And so she felt herself excluded, and that's, clear in the book as well, excluded from this kind of formal institutional space of learning and education. So she had a certain kind of inferiority complex as a result of that, even though she was incredibly learned and erudite. And, not very many people had access to the kind of library that her father had, which he, gave her full run of. So she didn't go to school. Her parents didn't send her to university and to school, but she did have this unrestricted access to his sort of remarkable library.
If we look at her career and her life, so A Room of One's Own comes in 1929, and by that time she's already published some of her famous novels like Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway, The Waves.
Not The Waves.
To the Lighthouse.
To the Lighthouse.
To the Lighthouse in 1927. How does that change her perspective and her stance as she's commenting on the state of women and fiction?
Yeah, I think she was already an established writer at this point, right? So, and the book grew out of 2 lectures that she gave at women's colleges, Girton and Newnham colleges that were part of the University of Cambridge. They weren't degree granting, so they weren't, completely a part of the university, but they had been open since, I think, 1869 and 1871 or something like that. So they had already been around for 50 years or so by the time she was giving these lectures. And she was invited as a kind of eminent personage, right? So she was speaking from a position of some authority. Yeah, so I think she wasn't writing from the position of a kind of upstart or a nobody. She was already a very established reviewer and essayist and critic. She was very active in the public sphere. She was really a public intellectual. And so I think that she's speaking from a certain place of confidence, let's say, even though there's a lot of there are a lot of moments of sort of self-deprecation in the essay.
So have the books that we've mentioned, the novels that had already been published, which have entered now the canon of British literature, were they popular at the time so that in 1929 those novels were common knowledge and educated people had read them?
They became increasingly so as, she was writing. And I think Mrs. Dalloway, was a bit of a turning point in her career. There are a number of turning points, and I think Mrs. Dalloway received a lot of attention that marked a kind of shift from her earlier writings and her earlier novels. But then also Orlando had actually been published just the year before A Room of One's Own. And Orlando was her biggest success, in fact, during her own lifetime. It was her biggest commercial success. It was a bit of an unexpected bestseller. And, it made her also money in a way that she didn't expect. This was, when she wrote A Room of One's Own, it was also a turning point in her own economic life where she started to really actually earn money from her books. And she had always written, journalism and reviews for writing, but she started to really earn money from her books, sort of enough money that she felt, as she said, for the first time she had money to spend. And she wrote in her diary that the spending muscle didn't really work naturally yet. But the success of Orlando meant that she was actually engaged, as she was writing A Room of One's Own, with the building of the construction of an additional room, which was to be her bedroom. Actually, it was 2 rooms, and then, a bedroom and a kind of office, essentially, at Monk's house, which was her residence in Sussex. So she was already pretty established. Orlando especially had been a kind of major and surprising success because it had been a sort of a romp, and she'd written it as a kind of lark, but it really deals actually with many of the same issues as in A Room of One's Own, so can be read as a kind of companion.
So 100 years later, is Orlando as enduring as Mrs. Dalloway or Jacob's Room or To the Lighthouse?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think that those books, they're very different, and she does different things in each of her novels, which is one of the kind of amazing things about her. She has such a distinctive prose style, so you always kind of recognize the Woolfian sentence, but the kind of form and the genre of each novel is different every time. She really didn't do the same thing over and over. So I think each of those books is really valuable and important in its own way. And I think, Orlando, I think, is one of the books that people actually really associate with her and really have taken up and have really embraced and find really interesting.
Speaking of reception, when A Room of One's Own was published in 1929, did it have traction at that point? Did people respond to it?
Yeah, it did. It also sold very well. I think something like 20,000 copies in the first 6 months, which was a lot, and a lot for her. It was well reviewed at the time. I think that Woolf's own reception was such that, she was very well known, I think, during her own lifetime, and she, appeared there were interviews with her in Vogue, in the 30s. And she was known in kind of magazines as well. But then after her death, her novels were kind of known, and she was known as a writer of interiority, not necessarily as a major modernist. For a long time, that label belonged to people like Joyce, like James Joyce, like T.S. Eliot. And she was more of kind of considered a kind of minor modernist figure. And then it's really with the rise of second wave feminism and feminist literary criticism starting in the 60s, but really the 70s and the 80s, that scholars really start to kind of recover her reputation, and also, importantly, all of this enormous nonfiction writing that she had done and that hadn't been really a part of her legacy or not associated with her. She didn't really have a reputation as someone who was a social critic or really engaged with social and historical problems of her day. She was really considered just this writer of interiority, maybe domestic dramas or novels of consciousness that, in some ways are opposed to works that are concerned with historical events or kind of the outside world. And her reputation sort of began to be reevaluated, and she began to be taken seriously also as someone who wrote a lot of nonfiction, who was thinking seriously and engaging with all of the important social issues of her day, and especially it concerns gender and feminism, and claimed as a kind of feminist forebear.
Well, with that in mind, does A Room of One's Own have a premise or several premises that she guides the reader through in this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of all there in the title, in a way, right? And she says it on like page 2. She kind of gives you the thesis up front. She says women need 500 a year in a room of their own if they are to write fiction or, more broadly to make art.
And she literally means a physical room for privacy of one's own.
Yeah, I think she means literally a room of one's own. And, I mean, it's funny. I think during COVID, we all like really confronted this, right? As our homes became workplaces, or, for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to stay home, this question of space and the importance of a space to think, especially if you had children. I had, a young child during COVID when COVID started, and then I had another one. So it was like a room of one's own was like an incredible luxury. So she does mean physical space, and I think that's part of her emphasis on the material conditions that are necessary to create works of art. So she's not so interested, even though she does kind of talk a lot about this, about the androgynous mind and the sort of ideal mind of the poet. But she's really concerned in this essay with what are the material conditions, like what do you need physically? What does she says, uses a beautiful image of a spider's web of fiction that's attached at all the corners, that it's not an ethereal thing. It's actually, rooted in the body. And if you are ill, if you are in some way don't have the physical necessities, then you can't actually produce this kind of work. And so when we think about that and why, as she says, why there are these absent books by women on the bookshelves of history, these material conditions are really crucial to answering that question.
Is she speaking autobiographically? Is she diagnosing a problem that she sees in the contemporary landscape? Or is she speaking historically and talking about women's lives throughout time?
Yeah, she's doing both. I mean, she is constructing a historical account. And so, the essay begins with this kind of the narrator. And it's maybe weird that an essay, a nonfiction essay, has a narrator, but I think it's fair to call her that. Being, at a women's college, at a fictional women's college in a kind of fictional Oxbridge, and having this very luxurious dinner with one of the men's colleges, and then having this very sparse, kind of sad, depressing dinner at the women's college, and sort of thinking, what's the reason for this disparity? And this leads her to then start looking through books, and to start looking through history effectively. And that kind of conceit allows Woolf to give this historical account of what have been the conditions of life for women, the average life of an Elizabethan woman, and as she says, through to the present day, and allows her to also give the survey of the women's writing that does exist. So works by 18th century writers who now actually I think are much more studied or much more known, or much more likely to appear on university syllabi, but were not at the time that she was writing. So it is this historical recovery, but she is also very concerned with addressing her audience in the present day. And the book ends with this kind of exhortation to young women who, she understands as now occupying a different position, and a position of much greater possibility to write books, and to write books of all kinds, as she says. So she both has this historical perspective and is really rooted in the present.
Dora, one of the books that we've already done on the Norton Library podcast is The Awakening by Kate Chopin. And one of the great plot points of that very short novel is the protagonist, Edna Pontellier, has artistic aspirations, and she has a beautiful, wealthy family life, but she has to go live someplace else by herself. And people accuse her of being insane because she has this urge towards privacy. And it seems like that's dramatizing 25 years, 30 years earlier, what Woolf is talking about in this essay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that issue of insanity, is not trivial and is not accidental. And sort of, because in part, I think this book is interested in sort of exploring something like a psychology of creativity, and what does it mean to be, what are the kind of conditions for a creative mind to be able to flourish and to actually produce works, and what happens if you have those urges, but you are deemed, aberrant or insane, as was the case for so many women, and as sort of is the case in some ways for her fictional character of Judith Shakespeare, Shakespeare's sister.
When you say that Woolf writes an exhortation in A Room of One's Own, is she ultimately optimistic or pessimistic about what she is arguing needs to happen? Will that happen, or does she not tip her hand one way or the other?
I think on the whole, I would say she's more optimistic than pessimistic. I think she's clear-eyed about the challenges facing women at the moment that she's writing, but I think she feels herself to be, and she feels the kind of current generation of women to be in a new historical moment, and with sort of unprecedented possibilities. And she ends by saying something, actually, I think I find very moving image of she returns to this figure of Shakespeare's sister, and she says, don't look for Shakespeare's sister, for Judith Shakespeare, in the history books. She lies, buried at the crossroads, but she's also unborn, and she will be born. She lives in you and me if we kind of create the conditions that will allow her to appear again. And so I think she's not optimistic in the sense that, she thinks it's preordained or like this is certainly going to happen, but she ends by saying it's really worthwhile to work, and as I read it, to work towards a kind of society that is supportive of, that understands writing to be a public good, the writing of books to be a kind of a public good, a human good, and that makes room and allows people of all stripes to engage in this kind of creative pursuit.
You've mentioned Shakespeare's sister a couple of times, which might be the most indelible idea in this entire book. Could you explain a little bit about what Woolf is constructing with the idea of Shakespeare's sister?
So she appears kind of partway through the book in a chapter where Woolf is saying, where are, women in the bookshelves of history? And she starts to look and she says, well, they're all over the place if you look in literature itself, but not if you look in the actual titles of the authors of the books, right? They're in the books because they're indelible figures, characters in books by men, but not as authors of books. And so she starts hunting through history books to sort of find out like what was the life of a woman, an average woman, let's say in Elizabethan England. And Orlando had also began in Elizabethan England and then ends in the present day as well. So it also has this kind of historical arc, although they're in this very fantastical case because Orlando lives for 300 years and changes sexes. But in the case of Judith Shakespeare, Woolf says, suppose Shakespeare had a sister who was equally as talented, but she, instead of being able to go to London and to kind of live at the center of the world and to be on the stage, she has to stay home and marry the neighbor's son and, keep the house. And she imagines her, even running off and trying to make her way, even going to London, but being rebuffed by the stage managers and eventually ending up pregnant by a stage manager who's actually a figure who appears in Orlando as well, Nick Green, and then ending by committing suicide, sort of out of options. And I think this kind of thought experiment, this counterfactual, or this character, this invented fictional character, is a way for her to just give life to concretize and to vivify this absence that otherwise is hard to make visible. And that's kind of a structuring feature of absence, is that it's not there. So I think she really turns to the resources of fiction and of all of her immense literary skill to make that absence present. And I think Judith Shakespeare is one of the ways she does that.
It's kind of chilling, at least to me, knowing how Virginia Woolf's own life turned out, to have her imagine this fictional Judith Shakespeare come to sort of a similar end. Do you see any kind of parallel?
Yeah, I mean, Woolf struggled with mental health kind of from a young age. She had her first kind of breakdown. Her first breakdown was precipitated by the death of her mother when she was 13, as she suffered a series of losses and struggled with mental health with breakdowns, and she attempted suicide and then eventually died of suicide in 1941. So, and in her books too, she, often has these characters who, are prone to hallucinations or who end up killing themselves, like Septimus Smith, this shell-shocked soldier, Mrs. Dalloway, Rhoda, this character in The Waves, who kind of can't quite keep her hold on reality and can't quite keep all the pieces together. Things just kind of fragment for her. So I think Woolf is very attuned to, very sensitive to people who are, really exquisitely sensitive and who have this kind of perceptibility and who have this sensitivity to these moments of experience and these aspects of reality that are, something other than just the mundane fact of getting from Monday to Tuesday, as she describes it in one essay. And, also this kind of sympathy for and sensitivity to people who just can't quite find a place in society in some way, so that Septimus Smith really, I think, embodies this. The doctors, William Bradshaw, this doctor, and Mrs. Dalloway emphasizes proportion and order, and that's also part of a national identity of what it means to be British, and Septimus just can't quite fit into that. And so, something similar for Rhoda. So I think she's very sympathetic to figures who in some way are at the margins of, who can't quite fit into the mold of a person that is prescribed for them.
Is this one of the situations, one of the examples where you say, well, in 2026, a character like Judith Shakespeare, she might exist, but there are way more mechanisms that if there's a young woman with Hamlet floating around in her consciousness, it'll come out. There are way more vehicles for expression these days, or is that a naive reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's undeniable that we live again in a different moment, right, than when Woolf herself was writing, and she was writing at a moment like she, I think, was not even saying that Judith Shakespeare would exist in precisely this way in her moment in 1929, and we're now, almost 100 years on. So I think we have made a lot of progress, and yet I think at the same time, many of these issues, the disparities certainly in something like the wage gap, but also I think in, the opportunities and the kind of effects of patriarchy that she's outlining in A Room of One's Own, I think those still resonate even today, even as we are in a very different kind of situation, and women have undoubtedly many more opportunities than they did in 1929.
Dora, I wanted to end with one more element of this book. You mentioned in your introduction to the Norton Library edition about the deployment of narrative voices that Woolf uses in A Room of One's Own. Earlier, you said all of her different novels have a slightly different narrative structure or even a different language. How do you assess the way she wrote it, her prose style, the way she communicated her idea? What do you see in this book?
It's one of the striking features about it because, it's a nonfiction, it's an essay, it makes arguments, but it does so in a very kind of roundabout, indirect way. And that has been both something that people have found really interesting and engaging and rich, and also something that people have criticized her for. Why be so oblique? Why not make these arguments in her own voice? Because she adopts these kind of narrative personas, or you might think of them as characters. She kind of has this idea of the four Marys, and they're sort of characters who are a little bit different from her. And she, as also the example of Judith Shakespeare shows, she kind of invents these fictional scenarios. And I think she does that for a number of reasons. First, I think she just probably can't help it in the sense that she is Virginia Woolf. She is a writer of fiction, and she really sort of just, she brings the resources of fiction to bear. But I think she needs fiction because, as I was saying earlier, when you don't have history, when there's nothing in the archives, you have to turn to the resources of fiction. And then it was also strategic. The other reason is that she said in a letter later, if I had just said, well, I'm mad because I never got to go to Cambridge like my brothers and like my father, then people would have just said, okay, she has a chip on her shoulder, and not taken her seriously. So, I think she is trying to persuade, and she does that in many ways. And one of the ways is through a kind of seduction of the reader. And so she is not writing in this kind of very straightforward she's not writing as a kind of firebrand, even though it is very polemical. And at the time, right, and the kind of arguments that she was making would have been very polemical at the time, but she is sort of trying to get the reader on her side through all of these indirect stratagems.
Dora Zhang, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your edition of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own.
Thanks for having me.
The Norton Library edition of A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, edited by Dora Zhang, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.